A single presidential decision has shaken the foundations of the global economy. Trump's 125% tariffs on China is creating a shift toward economic aggression. That shift, according to Singapore's prime minister, signals something far more serious and the collapse of rules-based globalization. Without those rules, stability vanishes. And when stability disappears, uncertainty takes its place. In that uncertainty, nations stop cooperating, and they start protecting their own interests at any cost. Singapore's warning cuts through the noise. If this trend continues, the damage won't stop at broken supply chains. It could spiral into global escalation, military standoffs, geopolitical conflict, even violence. History shows us what comes next, because it looks like a shift is about to happen, moving from tariffs to tanks. Let's find out why. The trade shock that shook the world. On what he called Liberation Day, former US President Donald Trump shocked the world by announcing a 125% tariff on Chinese goods. As if that weren't enough, he imposed a 10% base tariff on nearly every other trading partner, including long-standing allies like Singapore. The move was framed as a bold act of economic nationalism. America first, he called it, but for the rest of the world, it felt more like everyone else last. It was more than a tough policy stance. It was a seismic shift in how the US engages with the global economy, and it didn't go unnoticed. Singapore's new Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, responded with a national address that carried a chilling message. In his words, the era of rules-based globalization is over. Let that sink in for a moment. For decades, institutions like the World Trade Organization and multilateral trade deals helped maintain global order. They weren't perfect, but they offered a framework, rules, predictability, and diplomacy over chaos. Trump's tariffs don't just challenge that framework, they torch it. And now, the world is left with a far more dangerous question. The fire's been lit, but where will it spread next? Singapore's nightmare scenario. Singapore isn't just another country, it's a small, hyper-globalized city-state that thrives on trade, diplomacy, and its strategic balancing act between East and West. Every container that docks at its ports, every tech deal brokered, and every diplomatic alliance it nurtures is part of a carefully calibrated system. Prime Minister Wong didn't mince words when he described what's at stake. If other countries follow America's example, we risk being marginalized, squeezed out, left behind. Let's break that down. Imagine you run a business in Singapore. Your supply chain depends on imports from China, exports to the United States, manufacturing inputs from the EU, and logistics routes through Southeast Asia. Now picture this. Each of those partners begins rewriting the rules. New tariffs, new demands, each favoring their own industries first. Your business is no longer operating in a rules-based system. It's playing a game where the rules change depending on who you're dealing with, and you don't get a say. How do you survive in that kind of chaos? And if the World Trade Organization, the only neutral referee left, gets pushed aside, then it's not just Singapore in danger, it's any country that relies on global norms to protect their economic interests. The small, the strategic, the rule following, they all lose. This isn't just an economic inconvenience, it's a systemic unraveling. And if that sounds scary, just wait until we rewind the clock and look at what happened the last time global trade fell apart. Lessons from the 1930s. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Back in the 1930s, a single policy decision triggered a chain reaction that shook the world. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was intended to protect American farmers and manufacturers by raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. But instead of helping, it set off a global avalanche of retaliatory tariffs. Trade collapsed, countries turned inward, economies shrank, poverty exploded, and then World War II. What began as economic isolation and protectionism spiraled into a catastrophic global conflict. With collapsing markets and mass unemployment, countries grasped for control. Many found it through nationalism and militarization. As Prime Minister Wong warned, more and more countries will act based on narrow self-interest and use pressure or force to get their way. This is how wars begin in the modern world, not with the first shot fired, but with a spreadsheet, not with tanks on the border, but with tariffs at the port, a gradual erosion of cooperation, a rising tide of distrust. We've seen this movie before, and if we ignore the signs, we know how it ends. This chapter of history isn't just a footnote, it's a cautionary tale, a warning that when economies break down, diplomacy often follows, and in that vacuum, conflict finds space to grow. Because when global systems fail, countries don't just protect, they prepare. So if we're truly heading toward conflict again, the next question is this: where are today's pressure points? The new front lines of global power. Trade isn't the only thing that's strategic. In today's world, geography is power, and nowhere is that clearer than the South China Sea. This narrow stretch of ocean is more than a body of water. It's a choke point for over 1/3 of global shipping, carrying everything from crude oil to consumer electronics. Whoever controls these waters controls a significant portion of the world's economy. And guess who's watching it like a hawk? The United States, China, and every Southeast Asian nation caught in between, including Singapore. As tensions rise and economic diplomacy starts to fray, the vacuum doesn't remain empty for long. When negotiation fails, military deterrence fills the void. It's no longer a question of who makes the best product. It becomes who enforces their version of the rules, with ships, steel, and strength. Singapore's leadership sees this shift. They understand that soft power and economic influence are no longer enough on their own. That's why Prime Minister Wong emphasized, because if the global trade table collapses, Singapore doesn't intend to wait in line for scraps. It plans to build its own table, a coalition of nations still committed to order, stability, and cooperation. But that kind of shift requires more than strategy. It requires unity, readiness, and public will, because the next frontier of power may not be about trade routes or tariffs. It may be about how well a nation prepares its people for the storms ahead. And that leads us to the next challenge. How do you prepare a population for what comes next? The psychological war at home. Wong's message wasn't just aimed at diplomats or international leaders. It was directed at ordinary citizens. The tone of his speech made it clear. This was not business as usual. This wasn't just a policy update. It was a warning designed to mentally prepare the nation. He made it clear that the global conditions Singapore once relied on are gone, and they are not coming back. The age of stability has ended. The world has shifted into something far more unpredictable, and Singapore must be ready to weather what comes next, economically, politically, and socially. This type of language is rare from leadership. It wasn't about creating fear. It was about building mental resilience. It was about preparing people, not pacifying them. By framing the situation as difficult but navigable, the government isn't pretending things will be easy. They are acknowledging the weight of what's to come while reinforcing a sense of collective strength. This kind of psychological preparation matters. When people understand the stakes, they're more likely to stay calm, focused, and united under pressure. As the external threats grow, the internal mindset becomes just as important as foreign policy. In this environment, leadership isn't just about decisions. It's about guiding a population through uncertainty, and that guidance begins with the right story. Why storytelling is now survival. Wong's speech captured attention not because it delivered economic data or technical analysis. It went viral because it told a story, and in a time of global uncertainty, storytelling has become one of the most powerful tools a leader can use. He didn't just list problems or policies, he painted a vivid picture. First, he grounded the audience in a familiar past, an era marked by cooperation, stability, and global rules. Then, he shifted to the present, defined by disruption, fragmentation, and rising tension. Finally, he outlined a vision of the future, challenging, yes, but not hopeless. A future that could still be shaped by preparation, resilience, and unity. This structure wasn't accidental, it followed a timeless narrative arc, and that's exactly why it worked. Storytelling engages people on a deeper level. It activates not just their logic, but their emotions and memory. It transforms abstract geopolitical shifts into something personal and relatable. It gives people a way to process complex change through meaning rather than fear. Wong's strategy wasn't just to inform, it was to move people. And that's why his message stuck. It didn't feel like a lecture. It felt like a shared moment in history. In a world where facts alone often get ignored, stories cut through the noise. They guide public perception, they define national identity, and they prepare people for the road ahead. If Singapore's warning is accurate, the coming challenges won't just test political systems or economies. They'll test the strength and clarity of every nation's narrative, because in moments of crisis, the story you tell can shape whether your people panic or persevere. Tariffs to tanks, not inevitable. Let's be clear, this doesn't have to end in war, but avoiding that path requires action, and it requires it now. Wang's message wasn't fatalistic. It wasn't about predicting collapse. It was about pushing back against it. His speech was a call to prepare, to strengthen, and to stay ahead of what's coming. Singapore is already moving. It's not waiting for the world to catch up, but at the same time, it's calling on other nations to rise to the challenge as well. That means rebuilding trust in international systems that were designed to keep peace through cooperation. It means creating regional partnerships and coalitions that work, even when the world's biggest players don't. And it means preparing future generations not just with technical skills, but with the ability to navigate a deeply interconnected world through collaboration, empathy, and global thinking. History only repeats when we choose to forget it, and the patterns we're seeing now are not new. They've played out before with devastating consequences. So the next time you see a headline about tariffs, don't scroll past it. Pause and ask, who's really pulling the strings? What happens if this escalates? And what is the real price of a fractured world? The journey from tariffs to tanks is not inevitable, but it is possible. The road back from the edge begins with awareness. It begins with understanding how close we already are. And by making it to this point, by choosing to understand rather than ignore, you've already taken that first step.